Philippians. And we're not doing a verse by verse, but what we've noticed over the last several weeks is that Philippians is chock full of verses that we hear and see on Christian memes and on our social media and stuff all the time. And so we're kind of walking through the letter and connecting some of those things that Paul says in some ways that hopefully will challenge us. And our next stop, the one that we're about to stop on now, is Philippians chapter 4, verse 13. And of course, this is probably one of the more famous ones, but you'll see it here. It says that I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Right? Everybody has heard this, and I'm going to make the assumption that most of us watch sports, or at least if you don't really participate in them or participate in watching them, somebody in your house does, and you've heard some athlete get up and, maybe he's kicked a winning field goal, or the team won against, the odds that the team would win were small, but yet he made this play or she made this play, and now they've won the championship, and they're interviewing him or her after the match, and he says, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And we tend to look at that as if there's this impossible or at least improbable thing to do. And we've got this other person over here who's going to do this improbable or impossible thing. And they want you to know that they only accomplished it because of Jesus. And so really what that looks like for me is that it's really just more about the power of positive thinking, right? And so that's really what it works out, is to say, well, I can do all things through Christ. And really what that means is if I just set my mind to it, if I train hard enough, if I practice enough, if I go through the ritual enough, or whatever it might be, we end up saying, well, I can do that, but it's not really from me, it's from something else. And what I want to say is that is semi-true, but it largely fails to encapsulate what Paul meant when he says that. Paul's not trying to say that life is full of difficult and improbable or impossible things to do, and if you just believe enough, you can do them. And so if that's not really what Paul means, then we have to ask the question, well, what is Paul getting at then when he says, I can do all things through Christ? If Paul is not saying or meaning that we can just set our mind to it and accomplish it, then he has to be talking about something. And so the question is, well, what is that? And so here's what I want you to know, is that if you remember when we talked in the opening couple messages for this series, we said that Philippi was a Roman town. That Rome was full, of course, of soldiers who had retired, and Rome was overrun with people already. And so what Rome decided to do was to establish colonies all around the area, and they would send retired Roman officers to those colonies to live. And so Philippi was one of those towns. And so it's full of Roman soldiers. And what do Roman soldiers always know? We can do anything, all things, if we just set our minds to it. And so Paul writes this in such a way, though, that he wants to contradict what the Roman worldview is and substitute it with something else. And so in Paul's day, in the Roman worldview, here's what this might look like. That when a Roman looked at himself or herself, they would say, I am completely self-sufficient. That everything that I need to be successful in the world is already within me. And that all I must do then is to get access to what is already in me. And when I do that, and I do it well, then I can handle life's fluctuating circumstances. Because I am self-sufficient. self-sufficient. So in other words, when times are good, awesome. I can handle the good times because what is in me is self-sufficient. When times dip a little bit, that's okay too because what is in me is sufficient, and I can handle when times are lean as well. And I know what you're thinking already. You're looking at this Roman worldview and you're going, I don't really see anything wrong with that. Because that's what I already believe. And what I want to say is, of course you believe that. Because a lot of American thought was shaped by Roman thought and Roman philosophers and Roman writings, and people who came out of that era shaped shaped the thought of what a lot of our American forefathers believed. And so when we see something like that, we say, well, of course, it just makes sense. And if Paul doesn't mean that, then what in the world could Paul be talking about? Well, let me tell you what Paul's worldview is, and then we'll jump into Philippians chapter 4. But here's what Paul would have responded if asked the question, Paul, what do you mean? I think Paul would have said something like this: there's nothing in me that's worth anything. Paul has already said in Philippians chapter 2 and in Philippians chapter 3 that if I want to have the mind of Christ, if I want to follow Christ, I must do what? Empty myself so that I can gain or be filled with Christ or be filled with the Holy Spirit. That filling only happens after we had emptied ourselves. And so Paul would say that being completely empty, there is nothing within him to handle the good circumstances or the bad ones. Paul would say that he can only handle life and only do the things that he needed to do because of the one who gives him strength. It's completely opposite from the world of Philippi and the way they thought the world ought to be. And so if that's what Paul means in Philippians chapter 4, and Paul is not just encouraging us to some form of positive thinking and going out and accomplishing whatever it is we want to accomplish, if that's not what Paul means, and Paul rather means something like this, then how differently do we need to read Philippians chapter 4? So let's jump in and look at the text. We're going to start at verse 10. The nugget that we're landing on is, of course, in verse 13. But I want you to see what Paul says in verse 10. And that way we can get it all in its context. So Paul starts out and he says this. He says, I rejoiced in the Lord greatly. Now I want to stop here for just a minute, right? Because last week we talked about what the word rejoice means. It's not some inner feeling that just wells up inside of us and other people begin to see it. It's not that at all, right? Rejoicing in the ancient world was this, that I want everyone to know which god or goddess I worship, and the fact that I rejoice in that god or goddess is very symbolic, right? That I'm trying to get that God's attention because I want that God to do something for me or to move on my behalf. And so I rejoice and to get that God's attention. And Paul writes and he says, no, it doesn't work that way, right? He says you still ought to rejoice in God, but you don't have to get God's attention. The Lord is at hand. And so whatever it is that you need with prayer and supplication, you make that request be known to God, and God will give you the peace that surpasses all understanding. And so therefore, don't be anxious, right? Don't be filled with religious anxiety about whether or not you have God's attention. You already have it. And so Paul teaches that to the Philippian church. And so now in chapter 4, this is what Paul's living out. Paul is putting into practice the things that he has already taught the church. He says, look, I'm in prison. I am arrested, and the likelihood that my life is over is fairly high right now. And so what's Paul's response? I'm just going to rejoice greatly in the Lord. And when you look at what Paul says here, just the structure of the way this is laid out in the grammar, it's passive. And what that means is that there is another object acting upon the subject of the verse, right? And so in other words, Paul is saying, I'm just over here rejoicing, rejoicing, rejoicing. And there is another agent over here who's going to act upon Paul's rejoicing. And of course, we know that that's God, right? God is going to move on behalf of Paul's rejoicing. He's going to do so. Why? Because of what Paul already said. The Lord is at hand. He already knows, right? And so Paul's rejoicing, and God is going to move on Paul's behalf. But God's not going to show up and just blow the doors off the prison. God is going to show up in the presence of a person called Epaphroditus, who walks in, and he's a representative of the Philippian church. And he walks in and he hands them a letter from the church and also a gift from the church. And so God moves on Paul's behalf through the Philippian church and through a man who was a part of the Philippian church called Epaphroditus. And so Paul is rejoicing and he says, hey, you all have revived your concern for me. In other words, here's what Paul is saying in a very human moment. When you read the rest of this, right? You were indeed concerned for me, but you had no opportunity. So here's what Paul's saying. I've been just sitting here rejoicing. And as I'm thinking about all this, I'm wondering, did the Philippian church forget about me? They're my friends. I love them dearly. I want the best for them. But I'm wondering, did they forget? And so the response that Paul gets then, from God showing up in the presence of Epaphroditus and the Philippian church, he's like, oh no, you didn't forget about me. You just finally got an opportunity to show me how much I really mean to you. And he says, I'm so thankful for that. But Paul doesn't want everybody to know or to think that he's the kind of guy who's going to grumble and complain when something doesn't come his way. And so here's what he says. He says, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. In whatever situation I have found myself in, Paul says, I have learned to be content. Now listen, I just want to tell you this morning, I'm not a very content person. There's always something out there that could be better or is better. And the hobbies that I find myself engaged in, right, I'm always looking at the newest toy or the newest thing or the newest this or the newest that. When I'm shopping for cars because, there's always a car that has a new feature or a new this or a new that, and the one I have doesn't have that, and so maybe I should need this, and if I get this, my life will be better. And when I'm looking at my iPhone, I'm like several models behind, and I'm thinking, man, you know what, I'd like to have a new iPhone. Well, why? Because mine doesn't work? No, it works just fine, but the new one's got other bells and whistles that I like better. And then I look at my Apple Watch and I say, well, this is a Model 3. They're on like Model 4800 by now. So it's like, well, what if I upgraded that? Like, wouldn't that be better? Wouldn't that make my life wonderful? I'm not a very contented person, and my guess is, for a lot of you, you're probably not either. And maybe you're not struggling with material things. Maybe it's something else. Maybe you're not very content with the relationship that you have. And you look around and you say, boy, my relationship stinks. My husband's no good. My wife's no good. It's not this or it's not that. Boy, if I only had the relationship that that person has, wouldn't life be wonderful and wouldn't life be great? I'm not actually going to work to have that relationship, but boy, if I did have it, it would be wonderful. Or maybe it's finances, and you look around and you say, you know what, I'm 50 years old now. I don't have the retirement that I need. But boy, you know what, if I had that other job over there and I had that pension and this or that, I could retire great and I wouldn't have anything to worry about. we're just not very content. But Paul is letting the Philippian church know that he appreciates what they have done for him. But he says, ultimately, I'm okay whether you did it or not. Whether Epaphroditus showed up or not, I'm okay. Whether you sent a gift to me or not, I'm okay. It's great to have it, but I'd be content if I didn't. It's great to be talking to Epaphroditus, but if he wasn't sitting here, that's okay too. I'm still content. And that's a sweet spot to be in life, even though very few of us actually find it. We might say we're content, but if we did a life inventory, we're usually content because things went our way. And that shifts very quickly from situation to situation to situation. And so Paul says that he's learned to be content in every circumstance. Now look at the next verse. I think this is so profound. Paul says, I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. Here's what Paul's saying. There is a way to be brought low, and there is a way to abound in stuff and in things and in success. And Paul says, I have learned the secret of both of those things. Right? Whether I'm in hunger or I have abundance or I have need, whatever it is, Paul says, I know the secret to it. And so that causes me then to want to really pay attention, because there's something here that Paul's getting ready to tell the Philippian church that not everybody knows, right? It's something that's hidden for a lot of us. And Paul's saying, hey, church, pay attention, because I know how to do this. I know what it's like to have nothing, and I know what it's like to abound. And when I thought about what Paul's about to say, two people immediately came to mind for me. And I want to share the story of both of them. I thought about putting a picture on the screen of both, but, you probably know or have heard of them, so I decided not to, right? So I want you just to hear their story. And the first one is the story of a guy named Jack Whitaker. I don't know if you remember him or not, but some years ago, back in the 1990s, I believe it was, Jack Whitaker was from Jumping Branch, West Virginia, and on Christmas, right at Christmas, he walks into a gas station and he buys $100 worth of lottery tickets. He's already wealthy. His net worth at the time when he bought those lottery tickets was $17 million. Right? And so, lo and behold, a few days later, when the numbers drop on the lottery, guess who won? Jack Whitaker wins. He wins over $300 million. He decides to take a cash payout, and so he gets a check for $140 million. And here's what he does. He says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give 10% of everything that I have won to religious charities and churches and things like that. So he's going to tithe his winnings. And you can drive around in southern West Virginia today and you will see specifically churches of God who are named after Jack Whitaker because they got a ton of money from this guy. They built churches based on his contribution. But it was only a few years later that things went wrong for Jack Whitaker. Sitting on a huge pile of money, he decides that he's going to begin to live life lavishly. And a few years after he wins this huge amount of money, his granddaughter's boyfriend dies from a drug overdose. Shortly after that, his granddaughter dies from a drug overdose. His ex-wife dies as well. And in the story of this downward spiral, he finds himself one night at a strip club in West Virginia, and some people drugged him and then went went out into his car, broke into it, stole a suitcase full of cash. He had over $500,000 cash in a suitcase, and they just stole it. And when they asked him, what are you doing carrying around $500,000 in cash? His response was, because I can. And a few years later, the same thing happens, but this time he loses $200,000. And so on this downward spiral in Jack Whitaker's life, he died not long ago, and his total net worth when he passed away was $100,000. He went from having being worth over $150 million to dying with broken and busted relationships, lonely, and in need. There is a way to abound, and not everybody knows how to do that well. The flip side of that coin is another man who knows what it's like to have need and who knows what it's like to abound. And he's a football player. His name was Warrick Dunn. Warrick Dunn played football, I think, for 12 years. But before he ever made it to the NFL, his mom was a single mom trying to raise a family in New Orleans. And she was shot and killed in the line of duty. Warrick Dunn, she always wanted to buy a house, never could afford it. And Warrick Dunn took her life insurance money and bought a house for him and his siblings and decided he would raise his siblings. A few years after that, he makes it into the NFL. And he decides to open up a few charities, and specifically the thing that he did was to build houses for single moms. And as he built the house, he would furnish it completely for them, fill up the food pantry for them, where all they had to do was walk in and just live. He built 145 houses for single moms. I don't know what each of those houses cost, but I can't imagine building 145 houses, furnishing them, and all these other things, and doing that free. And then he had a multitude of other charities that are still in operation today. So here's the only reason I say that, is that some people know how to live when the cotton is high, right? And some of us struggle with that. Some of us struggle to live when things are slim and hard, and other people know how to do that well also. And this is at the heart of what Paul is saying here. Paul says there are times in life when things are going to be slim, and there are times when they're going to abound. And you need to learn to live well when both of those things happen. In fact, he said there's a secret to it. And the secret is just simply what he's already said: contentment. To learn to be content. Man, that's a tough one. When it seems like we never have enough. Look at the next verse. Because this is the proper context to read that in. Not I kicked the winning field goal, or I climbed to the highest mountain, or I did something like that. No, the proper context is here. I can do all things. What things? Live well in abundance, and live well when times are hard. And anywhere in between, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. Boy, that's a huge difference in saying that whatever is in me is enough. I am self-sufficient. And I have the means to make it through when times are good and when times are hard. Paul is saying the exact opposite. There is nothing in me. In fact, Paul says the only thing that I can produce, if you remember that bit of a controversial thing that Paul says. The only thing that I produce that my body puts out is just dung. It's feces. There's nothing good in me. The only reason that I can do what I do is because of the one who gives me the strength, the one who puts his strength in me, the one who allows me to do what I need to do in this world. I can lean on that strength and I will be okay, whether times are good or whether times are tough. It's okay because he's the one giving me strength. Now I want to say something that I really struggled with trying to say in the right way this week. Because you hold in your hands a Bible translation that says, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Or maybe you have a translation that reads, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And what I want to say is both of those things are completely accurate. Of course, that's the context of what Paul's talking about. But a more literal reading is a little different than that. And I want to just challenge you to hear just a literal reading of that and see if it maybe deepens how we understand this verse. Because a literal rendering of that verse would read something like this. I can do all things through the one who gives, let me say that again. I can do all things through the one who gives me strength. It doesn't say him, it doesn't say Christ, it's just the one who gives me strength. Now, in the context of what Paul's saying here, who is the one who is sitting right beside of him when he writes this letter? It's Epaphroditus. Paul's writing this letter to seal it up and send it back with Epaphroditus so he can have it read in front of the whole Philippian church. Was Paul strengthened by Epaphroditus? Yes. Was Paul strengthened by the gift that showed up from the Philippian church? Yes. Was Paul strengthened by the emptying of himself and the being filled and the gaining of Christ? Yes. It is all of those things. And it's important that we read it that way. Is that sometimes God strengthens us and God comes alongside of us, maybe not in some supernatural, overwhelming way, where we hear the voice of God and the clouds roll back and we are all of a sudden in the divine presence of God. Look, can that happen? Sure. But that's not exactly what Paul's talking about here. Paul says that sometimes it's the others who partner in the gospel with us, who walk alongside of us and encourage us. They give us the gift of continuing on in the Christian faith when sometimes it's just hard. And so is Paul strengthened through Christ in all things? Yes. But sometimes it looks like Epaphroditus traveling for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to be able to walk into a jail cell with Paul and say, Paul, here's the gift from the Philippian church. Let me meet your needs. Let me pray with you. Let me encourage you. And Paul says, that's amazing. That's just what I needed. Did that come from Epaphroditus? Yes. Did it come from God? Yes. And so what that tells me is that we need to be dependent upon one another for strength and for encouragement and for comfort. And sometimes the Lord works through us in those ways. And so Paul says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. This is not an easy answer to life. Paul wrote this, again, when he's in prison. In Paul's not saying, hey, if you just have some positive thinking, all of life's difficulties are going to drop away. That's not what he means at all. Paul was killed shortly after writing these words. But what if he meant something like this? Bump it one more. There we go. But we can, in any difficulty, when we are filled with the one who gives us strength. We can face any difficulty. We can do all things when we are filled with the one who gives us strength. So here's how I want to land this. What is it in your life right now that you are trying to fight on your own strength, because you've been told you are self-sufficient? Every answer to life's problems and difficulties lies within you already, and you're trying to work through whatever difficulty or troubling situation, whatever it is. What is it you're trying to do on your own strength that you have just found? I have failed, I have failed, I have failed, I have struggled, I have struggled. I can't seem to move forward. It's 2 steps up, it's in 3 steps back, right? Whatever it is, life is just kicking me in the teeth and I just can't seem to get ahead. What is it that you're trying to do on your own strength, your own understanding, your own self-sufficiency that has just landed you where you're at today and you're saying, this stinks? What if you took the approach of Paul and said, you know what, there's nothing I can do on my own except produce a load of feces. That's it. I need a righteousness that exists apart from me. I need a righteousness that comes from Christ. I need a righteousness that is external to me, but not remains there. A righteousness that God Himself will take and transplant into my life so that now I have the strength to do all things. To do what? To live in this world the way God wants me to live. I can't do it on my own. And church, until you come to that conclusion, you will fail again and again and again. Righteousness from Christ imparted to us to fill us after we have emptied ourselves. Paul says that's the secret to contentment. And at the end of the day, whether you have a lot or a little, when you're filled with Christ, you have all that you need. And there will be days when Epaphroditus shows up with a gift, and there will be days when nobody shows up with anything. And Paul says that's okay. So we're going to sing one last song this morning. And I want to just challenge you again with that question. What is it in life that if you could just empty yourself for a moment and then approach it from a different perspective, what is that one thing that could change? So we're gonna pray. We're gonna sing this last song, and while we sing it, you all know the routine if you've been here, right? You can pray wherever it is that you want to pray. You can affect change between you and God exactly where you sit. Positioning is not important as much as the positioning of our hearts. And so if it looks like for you, you can affect that change right where you're sitting, that's fine. You do that between you and the Lord. You turn over to Him whatever needs turned over. But if you need to come forward and pray, of course the stairs are open. And we have a prayer team here at the church. I will pray with you. Whoever, grab somebody to come and pray, and let's do that as well. Because sometimes the positioning does affect our heart. right? For me to be humbled in front of my church family. For me to let my church family know that there are things in my life that I need help with. And I want to pray and I need encouragement for those things. If that's you, just know that this is a safe space to do that. And so we'll pray with you. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not walking with Jesus at all. I hang out right here. You can come see me while this last song is playing. We can talk after church, whatever that is. I want to help you take that next step to get closer to Jesus. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for your love and your grace and your compassion.